Hello, synthesizer human beings, fellow human musical synthesizer aficionado enthusiasts. Today, I'm going to be talking about the digital dark ages, as Dave Smith so succinctly coined the term. And more specifically, for those who may not be familiar with the digital dark ages, I'm referring to the late 80s and early to mid to late 1990s, into the 2000s. I'm going to be referencing the one keyboard magazine that I purchased with my own money back in the 90s. I really wanted to learn how to play salsa. Well, I'm still working on it. But I want to read through a couple of interesting articles in here. So, I've basically held on to this one issue of Keyboard Magazine since 96, yeah. One of the featured keyboards in this issue was the Korg Prophecy. I remember playing the Chord Prophecy in Wurlitzer, thinking to myself, maybe analog will be coming back. Maybe tactile controls will be coming back, because that's what this was sort of an answer to. Also featured in this magazine, Tangerine Dream and Eat Static. I'm familiar with both of those acts. Tangerine Dream is a huge influence on me. And Eat Static is the side project of Joey Hinton, the former keyboard player for Ozric Tentacles. Now, if you have not heard Ozric Tentacles, go check them out. If you're into synthesizers and you've never heard Ozric Tentacles, and I'm talking about albums like Plans, Waterfall Cities, Pungent Effulgent, Jurassic Shift, do yourself a favor and check any one of those records out, because it's absolutely amazing. And Ozric Tentacles really utilized digital synthesizers more than a lot of other bands at the time. I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So kind of just reading through this even now. Oh, this is great. Just some of the old adverts for Logic, right? Which I currently use Logic, but this is one of the old adverts here. I'll throw some pictures up as I'm talking about it. This is kind of distracting. I remember buying this thinking, oh, finally there's a magazine for keyboard players. I can read about Rick Wakeman, and I can read about Rick Wright and Francis Monkman, or anybody, any great keyboard player in rock. Instead, it was a bunch of DAW tips and tricks, a lot of pro audio tips, mainly a focus on technology and the gear itself, and not a whole lot of mention of musicality or keyboard players. And that's why this is the one and only issue of Keyboard Magazine I ever bought. Now, there might have been other great issues of this magazine, but yeah, it was no Nintendo Power, that's for sure. But I do find this kind of fascinating reading it now. So, around the time this issue came out, there was a mounting desire for the old analog gear. And that's definitely prevalent in the design of the Korg Prophecy. And I think in a lot of ways the Nord lead really started to actualize that desire. Started an old trend that needed to be started. But just kind of glancing through this, I'm just as bored reading this now as I was when I was 14 years old or so reading this. I mean, other than the salsa bits, I still need to work on the salsa. But and the gear's interesting. Some of the gear's interesting, but you know, there's just I don't know. Keyboard players in the rock world are more often than not an afterthought, an addition, icing on the cake. You know, little bits of candy you get after you have the real meal. Of course, myself as a keyboard player always looked at it the opposite way. You know, I consider keyboards to be the mother of all instruments, whether it's piano, harpsichord, organ. It's the best. You have the full orchestral range of sound at your fingertips. And undoubtedly for composing, for songwriting, I mean, just look at the greatest composers of all time. Most of them also played keyboards, and that includes Frank Zappa. Anyway, so during the 90s in my area, I can't speak for the world or even the whole country, but in New England, southern New England, in Rhode Island specifically, where I was growing up, there weren't a lot of keyboard players in the original independent rock scene. There really weren't. I know because as a keyboard player in that era, I constantly was getting asked to join bands. And I'm not even a fantastic keyboard player, or at least, you know, I wasn't at the time. I had to turn down a lot of bands, and there just weren't a lot of keyboard players. There were keyboard players in cover bands playing digital workstations, sure, tons. And there was definitely keyboard players playing in jazz bands and in blues bands. But I'm talking about just original music, just, you know, young bands starting out playing nightclubs. When my band would play out, we'd always make a really big impact because I had keyboards with me, and people weren't used to hearing keyboard players in original music bands in my area. I noticed when I was living in Virginia for a while, there's a ton of keyboard players in Virginia, and most of them are gospel worship style keyboard players, and they're fantastic, absolutely phenomenal. You go to a guitar center in Norfolk, Virginia, and you're going to eat humble pie just about every time you go in. But if you go to, I don't know, you go to a guitar center in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, you're not going to hear too much shredding. All right? Even, was it the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, the guitar center there, I got noticed in that guitar center. I actually got offered session work. Didn't really take advantage of it because I was only there for a little while, but keyboard players have this sort of ambiguous role where the popular idea is to put the keyboard player in the back, you know, in the back of the band and have them hover on pads and play little melodic phrases and pretty much just stay out of the way. Well, that's not the way I approached keyboard playing. I looked at it different ways. It could be a keyboard, sure. It could be a guitar. It could be a bass. It can be a, what's the word I'm looking for? An autonomous solo orchestra. It could be a lot of things, depending on your imagination and your technical ability. And in the 90s, your technical ability wasn't as important as your playing. What do I mean by that? Well, you had a ton of romplers. Like Dave Smith said when he coined the term the digital dark ages, it began with the Korg M1 in 1987. And it's pretty much been rinse and repeat ever since then as far as digital workstations go. Korg M1 set the benchmark for it, and all the manufacturers have basically been producing their own version of the M1 with updated bells and whistles ever since. And it led to a lot of stagnation. And there was one local concert in Providence. I think it was in 1997 or 1998. and the actual flyer had a picture of someone's mini Moog, and that was what was drawing people to the show, was the fact that someone actually had a mini Moog in working order and was going to play it live. I wanted to go to that show. I have no idea who the artist was. I never did go, but I've always been curious about it because, you know, again, keyboards and keyboard players were like three-headed unicorns. My live debut was at my high school at a Battle of the Bands, and I had a realistic MG1, which is basically a Moog knockoff, made in collaboration with Moog. Great little synthesizer, actually, and we actually won that Battle of the Bands, oddly enough. It's too bad because I thought the guitar player was out of tune. Turned out it was my Moog MG1. Anyway, so yeah, during the digital dark ages, there was a lot of homogenized keyboard music coming out. And even some of my favorite keyboard players like Joe Zawinul and Edgar Froese from Tangerine Dream, their sounds that they were getting, I mean, Zawinul was using a Korg M1 in the 90s, and he still sounded amazing and still was incredible and everything, but I noticed that those newer sounds didn't reach me in my heart and in my gut the way the analog gear did. Same thing with, listening to Genesis. I get down on just about every era of Genesis except for We Can't Dance, actually, and that's because the Romplers really took over. And even, I think when Genesis toured in 2007, Tony Banks was using the Korg Oasis, which on paper looks like an incredible workstation. I know it's the precursor to the Kronos, I believe. But listening to the keyboard sounds on it, I just didn't do it for me. I mean, don't get me wrong, it still sounds great. It's still Genesis, Tony Banks, still one of my favorites. But I just wasn't convinced by the Korg Oasis. In fact, I don't think, other than a few exceptions, one of them being the Nord lead, I don't think that other keyboard manufacturers have really harnessed digital polyphonic analog synthesizers until very recently. I'm talking the last 10, 15 years. Now, I could be wrong. There's certainly keyboards, there's more keyboards that I haven't played or heard than that I have. I've never played an Access Virus. I've heard that's one of the best digital synths out there. For my money, and again, because I'm a Roland guy, I like my Roland System 8. I did have a Phantom. I had to sell it. Well, I didn't have to. I chose to sell it. I sold my Roland Phantom 7, which I never thought I would sell, but I did. I sold that and my Korg Op 6 and used the money to purchase a Nord Stage 88 and a System 8, which is exactly what I need for me. See, what I've realized about myself at 40 years old is that I cannot stand having a screen on my instrument. If I can watch TV or play video games on my instrument, no good. That's the main reason why I use so much outboard gear, is to avoid being stuck in my DAW, which is a necessary evil. But there's something about staring at a computer screen and making music that just seems to like conflict with each other a little bit. Anyway, some of the ads really make me laugh, especially for Logic. I got the Kurzweil K2000, K2500 there, I think it is. Yeah. I can't. Hey, if you want a subscription, you can save some money. I'll send you this little keyboard magazine discount. You get 12 months for only $25.95. But yeah, there's you could tell that there was a lot of mom and pop operations at this point, especially in the plug-in game. mean, you'll be jamming. At least that's what they say. Sample discs. Feel free to copy any of these numbers and order them. Again, even now, it's like, this is just, why? Why? I mean, why aren't we talking about music here, Keyboard Magazine? What the heck is going on? The Chord Prophecy. I used to see this keyboard in EU Wurlitzer all the time, and I would play it, and I didn't really get the hype behind it. I really didn't. Yeah, it's too bad lead synthesizer playing is dead. All those sampling maniacs laying down their monotonous looped beats. All those stadium rockers grabbing two-handed power chords and hanging on till the cows come home. All those jazzers who decided, for good reasons, that electronic instruments were just too stale and sterile to pay much attention to. Who the hell is left that cares enough about soloing to buy this incredible new monophonic lead synth? Well, just in the first paragraph of this article, it actually really describes that era of time in the 90s. Everybody in my neck of the woods was obsessed with 70s rock and late 60s rock. You know, Jerry Garcia and the Rolling Stones and the Byrds. It was all about guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. And you know, me being a massive Genesis fan or Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan or Yes fan, very, very few people to share in that interest with me. I actually had to create fans of these bands by insisting my friends listen to their records. And eventually, you know, I had a few people to talk about Genesis and Emerson, Lake and Palmer with. But needless to say, I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that these bands were just universally hated in my neck of the woods. I didn't understand. And these bands also used guitars and acoustic instruments and had organic music making methods that didn't involve electronics. To me, these progressive rock bands were just more interesting. I get bored listening to a Rolling Stones record, still. You know, it's very formulaic. I'm sorry for you rock purists out there, but I get bored hearing the same chord voicings over and over again. The same types of melodies, the same rhythms. I'm not going to listen to a whole record of that. You know, I might hear a Rolling Stone hit like during the Brian Jones era. I can get down with that. When Brian Jones was with the Rolling Stones, yeah, that was interesting to me. And hell, even bands like Led Zeppelin, who I'm not a super huge fan of in my adult years, still a hell of a lot more interesting to me than like the Grateful Dead. Sorry, Deadheads, Dead fans. I never did anything for me. All right, so I'm going to quote from this interesting article from this magazine from the great Edgar Froese from hope I'm saying that right, from Tangerine Dream. Again, pretty relevant to the conversation of the digital dark ages. He says here, in my own musical world, and I think every true musician and composer will agree, you should never think too much about what others do or have. The moment you are absolutely unique with the musical micro or macrocosm of sounds, it does not matter whether that particular feeling hits you whilst sitting at a $100,000 concert grand piano or by pressing keys on a $200 Casio keyboard, which has maybe been stolen at twilight from the backyard of a department store. To me, music has absolutely nothing to do with this materialized world of unpleasant and destructive ways of human behavior and living. The world of music is something on its own. It's absolutely dust-free, clear, and clean. Music is one of the most neutral things on earth. It symbolizes the highest frequency of all art forms in its abstract, neutral manner. Pretty good. And then the writer of the article says, yet it is debatable whether some of Tangerine Dream's groundbreaking recordings would have been possible without their custom-built equipment, much of which remains in Edgar's possession to this day. I still own all of the analog equipment. It's stored in a basement somewhere in Germany, says Edgar. With the current analog revival. This is funny because this is, I believe this is 1996, right? And again, we're talking about almost a particular moment in time when the peasants of the digital dark ages gathered their pitchforks and their torches and marched up to the castle and started demanding, clamoring for their analog synthesizers. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. All right. With the current analog revival, his reluctance to divulge the location of this Aladdin's cave is understandable. See how rare these things are, and they still are. Okay. Jerome later rekindled my curiosity by revealing that the large, heavily customized modular synthesizers with the overhead lamps visible on the sleeves of the 1977 double live album Encore are also in storage. Obviously, Edgar has a theory about the particularity of second-hand analog synthesizers today. Edgar says, I laughed back in the days when people started selling their entire analog equipment because of the Yamaha DX7. If you are used to the process of creating sounds electronically, you should know that FM sounds could never create the same frequency structure as a low or high pass filter influence the waveform of an oscillator. It's a completely different process. The voltage controlled principles simply cannot be reconstructed by FM synthesis. One should ask Bob Moog about his fantastic voltage-controlled filter. It was a miracle, and he could tell you even more about that actual process, which I guess is still unbeatable today. Without Bob Moog and Tob Oberheim, Tangerine Dream's history would have to be rewritten. Both are great minds. They should be credited on all pop and rock records these days. I would just insert Dave Smith in there as well. Bob Moog, Tom Oberheim, Dave Smith, and the founder of Roland. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce his name right off the top of my head. Kakahashi, Kitaro Kakahashi. I'm not going to try. When talking of a warm sound, what people believe they hear is not really the sound source, but the image of a sound created by a filter. The filter is doing the massive work, and that can partly explain why analog is a completely different world. If you give up analog, you give up a big portion of your musical ability, technically. The author goes on to say, I asked Edgar whether he would consider using any of these devices again. It depends on Tyranny of Beauty. It depends. On Tyranny of Beauty, you hear Moog and Oberheim sounds from beginning to end. If it's necessary to do something, then I will. Everything is midified now, so I just hook it up and it works. Musically, Edgar is clearly not one for looking back. Yet, according to Jerome, that's his son, he is in his element when playing the likes of the Roland Jupiter 8 and Jupiter 6 analog polysynths, which nestled comfortably alongside their digital counterparts during my visit. A quick glance around the studio revealed a Korg T1, undoubtedly functioning as a master keyboard, at an Apple Macintosh Quadra-based workstation, a Kurzweil K2000, a Roland D70, JD800, and JV1080, and numerous rack-mounted modules, including a Korg Wave Station, AD, a Waldorf microwave, an Oberheim Matrix 1000, an expander, tuning stabilized mini Moogs, a Yamaha TX816, and various EMU Proteuses. All right, so I'm not going to read the whole damn thing, but even at the time, the synth community had an awareness that they were missing something. Something big, something fat, warm, and huge. All right? I'm not talking about my gut either. I'm talking about the sound of analog synthesizers. And on the flip side to this digital dark age discussion, the digital technology was very new at the time. Data compression, memory was very limited. So if a Roland System 8 had been possible to make in 1990, that might have been a really bad thing for the analog synth revival. Because the keyboards like the System 8 are so good that they almost make you question whether or not they're analog. It's that close. I'm going to get into the System 8 in another video because I'm completely bowled over by this synthesizer. And I do have a reference point for it. I do have the original JX3P, and then I have the JX3P emulation in here, and spot on. Absolutely spot on. Like really like 95% close or greater. So I think digital technology is better than it's ever been. And one could argue that easily. On the flip side, it would be hard to argue that analog synthesizers are better than they've ever been. I think they are. But they do not sound the same as antique analog synthesizers. And yes, they are antiques now. They don't. But why would you expect them to? I'm sure composers at the turn of the 19th century were arguing about who makes the better piano. And I'm sure there was lots of subtle differences that threw off musicians and composers all the time between spinets and upright pianos and grand pianos. You can go on and on and on. I guess the kind of what are we in a renaissance now? Is that what we're in? Is this an analog revival? Is this a renaissance? I can't say that it's a real genuine renaissance, because I guess I associate free thinking with the Renaissance, and this isn't necessarily an age of encouraged free thinking. Synthesizer music is more popular than it's ever been, and will only continue to get more popular, which I knew would happen. I used to say in the 90s all the time, oh, if this was the mid-80s, with my skills, I'd be working all the time. Well, now it's 2022, and there are a lot of keyboard players in my area. I can't say too many of them play all that good, but they definitely tweak knobs a lot and hold down drones and stare at their feet a lot. I'm sorry, I'm being kind of a shitbag, but I think we're in an era now where we're in like the musical dark ages. We need a cultural refresh where we focus on our art again. We focus on the music we're creating and not the gear. And I'm no better than anybody else. A big part of my channel is basically a big glorified show and tell. Okay, that's what most of us are doing. We're grown human beings showing off our electronic gizmos. This is what I like about it. This is what I don't like about it. My other favorite YouTube channels at least have some music, some storytelling, some comedy, and that's what keeps me interested, is the content, the creativity. I will subscribe to a channel with unusual ideas. I will watch a channel for a synth review, but that doesn't mean I'm going to subscribe to it. And quite frankly, I don't care if you subscribe to my channel or not. I sort of made this channel for myself and a few friends, and I made a channel that I wanted to see so that I could watch it, listen to it in my free time. I know, it sounds kind of weird. I'm kind of a weird guy. I'm a keyboard player. What do you expect? But, yeah. I mean, that's when you look at a guy like Jack Perry, who at the time of this article was on tour with Barry White. Perry loves older analog-based synths, but he keeps both new and old instruments on hand. His studio and stage setups include an ever-changing array of Mac and PC-based sequencers, several Akai MP60s, a Korg 01W T1 wave station, a Mini Moog, a Yamaha TX816, a Kurzweil piano module and controller, a Roland JD800, U110, MKS70, MKS20, and MKS50, and a lot of Roland samplers. On stage, I keep it simple, with the JD800 as the acoustic piano, and the 01/W triggering the TX816 for a blended Rhodes sound. In the studio, I lean towards the older equipment because I like the warm analog sound. I always seem to go back to the older synths, like the Mini Moog and the Oberheim OBX. I mean, are we seeing a trend here? He likes the Mini Moog, right? For drum sounds, I use the Lynn and Roland machines. Not sure which ones he's talking about. I need them to be as big as Barry's voice. Ranky-dink sounds just won't do. Certainly not, especially when you're touring with Barry White. Now, if we're really going to go into the digital dark ages, there were a few groups, metal groups in the 90s that had some really, well, all right, there was one metal group that had some pretty interesting keyboards. And that was Typo Negative, Josh Silver. He used a Korg M1. Listen to the album October Rust by Typo Negative. That is some of the finest Korg M1 you'll ever hear. Beautiful, lush. Josh Silver really creates a nice unique ambient vibe with the Korg M1. And then you got fellas like Madonna Wayne Gacy of Marilyn Manson, who basically was more or less a human sampler. Right? He just hit the buttons that made the sample noises, but he also played some basic stuff too. He even says it here in his little blurb. Gacy locks into the interview like a laser beam. I don't consider myself a keyboard player, he says, rocking back and forth. I am more of a sound deformer. I'll spend hours with the Kurzweiler K2000, not trying to write songs or practice scales or learn chords. That kind of shows, too. I've never been about that. I went to school for engineering. I understand computer programming. That's how I got into sampling. And sample he does. Yep. Well, that's cool, I guess.